All right, it's rolling, Bob. Welcome to another edition of Popular Music Books in Process. By my count, the 21st. Is that right, Kim? Um,
Yes.
Something like that. We are a collaboration, and we always like to say, between the Journal of Popular Music Studies, IASPM US, and the Pop Conference. We also, as of this week, have a new call out for 2021, which I hope everybody has seen. It is posted on both the IASPM US page and the Pop Conference page. You can also check out previous editions of the series on my YouTube page. Thanks to the already nodded to Kim Mack and Carl Wilson, my co-conspirators on this crazy project. And I think that's all the prelims. Today we're welcoming Joanna Love and Steve Waksman, who are both talking about live music and presenting books that are still in the process of getting finalized. Oh, that's one other thing I should just note quickly for the folks in this room and who might be listening on YouTube, is that we very much want, with the 2021 call, to encourage people who are at an earlier stage of the book writing to think about getting involved. You can do that with a digital lecture to start our group off, but for the first part of the series, there was such a backlog of authors who'd published books who needed to get the word out. That's a little bit different now. So we really encourage people at all stages to get into the series. All right, I'll stop and introduce our excellent panelists for today. So Joanna Love is Associate Professor of Music at University of Richmond, specializing a lot music in US national brand and political advertising. Her last book was called Soda Goes Pop, Pepsi-Cola Advertising and Popular Music. She's co-editing a volume called Sonic Identity at the Margins, but the book that she's going to be talking about today is Turf Wars, The Politics of Popular Music at America's Super Bowl. Steve Waksman is, oh boy, Sylvia DeLugash Bauman,
yeah.
Bauman, Professor of American Studies and Professor of Music at Smith College. His books include the electric guitar book, Instruments of Desire, the Is That Heavy Metal or Punk? Why Not Both book, This Ain't the Summer of Love. And he has also co-authored the most recent edition of the textbook Rockin' Out, co-edited the Sage Handbook of Popular Music, and the book he's working on that we're going to be hearing about is called Live Music in America, A History from Jenny Lind to Jay-Z, forthcoming from Oxford Press. And then the final normal bit of that we always note is, typically what we do is we ask people to post comments along the way in the chat, also questions if they come up. Kim will monitor that, and about 45-50 minutes in, call you to speak into the camera. All right, well, Steve, Joanna, welcome, take it away.
Thanks. I'm going to start us off. Hi, everyone. Really glad to get to present today. I want to really thank Joanna for inviting me to join her on this session, because this was originally just supposed to be hers. And also want to thank Carl and Kim and Eric for putting this together, not just today, of course, but since what, July or something. And it's, great. I'm glad it's going to keep going in the spring. So I'm going to talk for about 15 minutes. Joanna will do about the same. We'll spend a few minutes talking to each other about our respective projects and presentations, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So let me share my screen, and then I'll really get going. All right. Do you all see what you should be seeing? Yes, okay, good. So the project I'm talking about, well, what I'm talking about today is like a tiny sliver of my larger book project. I circulated a short description of the larger project. I'm not going to even come close to trying to summarize it today because it's huge. If you looked at the project description, you see it covers 150 plus years of history. It crosses genres, it crosses types of venues. It really tries to be a very broad synthetic work, but it's also based on a lot of pretty deep archival research. And so rather than try to encompass the whole thing, I'm just going to try to zero in on one slice of it today that I think will dovetail nicely with what Joanna is going to be talking about. And so, as you can see, I'm really focusing on the phenomenon of arena and stadium concerts for today. And it's something I've been looking at in different ways for quite a while now in various aspects of my research. And as you may know, many of you here, a lot of the commentary on arena rock or arena concerts, I try not to say arena rock because it's so genre specific, and so I use arena concerts. But there's a lot of very moralistic talk about this phenomenon, right? It's all about like arena concerts were just a big cash grab. And then they're kind of like dismissed as being like, you know, not very interesting. People get very Adorno-esque about it. And that's a perspective I've tried to critique pretty strenuously in some of the work I've done along the way. And I continue that into my new project, being a history of live music. I have a lot to say about a lot of things regarding live music, and this is one of them. There's no question that the live concert industry entered an economy of scale that had not really existed before with the emergence of arena and stadium concerts. But in order to understand that, I think we need to really understand how it worked as a mode of production rather than just say this was bad. And so that's really what I've tried to do, is to dig deep into this basic question of how do these concerts happen? How are they produced? You know, not just in terms of how do they generate profit, but what do they try to do and how do they do it? So that's what I'll be trying to talk about here in the little bit of time that I'm going to take. There we go. To just start with a really basic factoid that I think opens on to some bigger issues of significance. You know, the Beatles playing at Shea Stadium in 1965 is often pointed to as this great milestone in the history of rock performance and in the history of arena and stadium events. But it's often overlooked that when the Beatles played Shea Stadium in 1965, Shea was only like a year old. And I think this really matters because one of the issues, right, if we're talking about like how did arena rock happen or how did arena concerts become so conventional? Well, a big part of it has to do with the venues and how the arenas and stadiums that were the most identified places where these concerts were taking place really proliferated starting in the mid-1960s, really from around 1964, 65 to the early 1980s. There was this enormous wave of arena and stadium construction. And of course, it wasn't driven by the desire to put on concerts. It was driven by the increasing growth of the sports industry. And in some sense, the concert industry was sort of piggybacking on that. But eventually, the concert industry, as we know, assumed a momentum that was very much all its own. So to kind of further codify how much just the sheer spread of arena venues mattered to this phenomenon, we can look at this list, which is all the venues that the Rolling Stones played on their 1969 tour, which was, again, kind of a landmark tour. It's the tour that ultimately culminates in Altamont, of course. And in many accounts, that's really all that anybody talks about regarding this tour. But it was a really important tour for many other regards. I've actually published a whole separate essay on this tour. It's not part of the book, but you know, there's definitely more to be said about it. But for now, what I really want to draw attention to is just, you look at this list of venues, and I've highlighted all of the dates when these venues first opened to the public. And the ones that I've highlighted in red are venues that only opened in 1965 or later, which is to say in the year that the Beatles played Shea or after. So 9 out of the 15 venues that the Stones played at in 1969 only opened after basically the Beatles played at Shea. So if you want to talk about how did arena concerts become so conventional in the late 60s and 70s, well, this is a huge part of the story that rarely gets documented. And I have to pay tribute to this architectural historian Howard Schubert, who wrote this incredible book about the history of hockey arenas that I just think is like one of the best things ever, and is absolutely essential reading if you have any interest in this subject at all. Okay. Then the question is, so a key part of arena concerts as an industry is that they don't just happen once, right? It's not a festival where you have this unique event like Woodstock or whatever. Arena concerts happen as part of tours. So then the question is, how do things move around? How do you get the concert from one place to another so that it can be done in all these different venues? And so that brings up the importance of a company like the one that's pictured here. This is the Clark Transfer Company. And Clark Transfer was a trucking company. They started work in 1949, mainly working with theatrical companies who had road shows that they had to get from place to place. And they start working with rock concerts in the 1970s. And this is a brochure that they issued sometime around probably 1974. And I'll just read you, because it's probably hard for you to see, but I'll read you some of what they say in order to build up what services they provide. Clark's modern fleet of 100 tractors, 40 trucks, and 125 air ride trailers gives us the unlimited capability to handle tours requiring anywhere from a single 20-foot truck up to multiple trailer load tours like Emerson, Lake and Palmer with 7 units, and the Metropolitan Opera with 25 trailers, right? High versus low, out the window. The fleet of equipment is mated with logistic cargo handling systems, pads, racks, and magnesium ramps to transport your electronic synthesizers, delicate sound systems, lighting, and expensive musical instruments with care and safety. Without these trucks, arena rock as a phenomenon does not happen. And then the question is, of course, what are they carrying? So you get some sense of it in that last part of their brochure description. People are carrying sound equipment. They're carrying lighting. They're carrying stage equipment. And they're carrying props. The props are probably the most kind of funny and notorious part of this whole mode of production. I've chosen a couple here to focus on. I think these what I think of as the ridiculous and sublime aspects of rock concert staging or pop concert staging in the 1970s. On the left, you've got Mick Jagger standing next to the giant phallus that the Rolling Stones featured on their 1975 tour. They used to nickname this phallus the Tired Gentleman because it had trouble staying up. On the right, of course, we've got the Mothership from Parliament Funkadelic's 1976 Mothership Connection tour. And you can see, it's a little maybe hard to see, but George Clinton is descending the steps that lead down from the Mothership. This was a prop that descend from the top of the arena onto the stage, and then Clinton would come out and would start to join the band who were kind of summoning him in the time leading up to this very ritualistic kind of thing. Two very different modes of arena concert stagecraft, but they're linked by a really important common denominator, which is this guy, Jules Fisher, who was a Broadway lighting designer who moved into concert production in the 1970s. As a Broadway theatrical designer, he worked with the original cast production of Hair. He worked with Jesus Christ Superstar. He worked with Pippin. He won multiple Tonys. He's considered to be one of the real architects of modern theatrical lighting. In 1974, he moves into rock concert production. And his first move in that direction is working with David Bowie on the Diamond Dogs tour. The next year, he works with the Stones on their 1975 US tour. And then he subsequently works with Kiss. He works with P-Funk and others, and had a really illustrious career in that area for a few years, while remaining active in the realm of Broadway and musical theater. So I'm going to focus on the Stones tour because it's really well documented in the archives. And so I've got some nice show and tell that I can do here, which I'll do for the rest of my time. The 75 Stones tour is not generally considered to be the greatest tour the Stones ever did, musically speaking, but it was kind of a landmark for their staging. And so you see here on the right, you see this really elaborate lotus petal stage design that was put together by a scene designer who actually had a long-term association with Fisher, a guy named Robin Wagner. And what you see on the left is a document I found in the archives. This is archives at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame that show the diagram of the stage and the rigging, as it's called, that was going to accompany the stage so that all the lights and all the amps and everything that was needed to put on the show were in their proper place around that stage. And this was a much more elaborate kind of setup than the Stones had ever used in any of their earlier tours. Here we see an adjunct to the stage design, which is just the lighting design. So on the left, what you see is a diagram of the lighting configuration that would have hung above the stage. And since Fisher was himself a specialist in the area of lighting design, this was a real area of expertise for him. On the right, there's this great memo that, again, was in his papers. And it really kind of outlines what I would call like Fisher's philosophy of lighting in a nutshell. It's the whole memo is 4 pages long, and it goes into incredible detail. And as you can see, if you can see the little print, it's addressed directly to Mick Jagger, right? And this is in March of 1975. This is 3 months before the tour is on the road. So this is all in the pre-planning stage where Fisher's like, here's what I'm going to do. And so let me read you the description of how he summarizes for Jagger what the configuration is going to be for the tour. The basic lighting will be provided by a hexagonal or geometric shaped light ring suspended over the stage between 28 and 35 feet. And that's exactly what we see diagrammed on the left. This will contain a mammoth amount of equipment to provide backlight on all the band members in 3 or 4 colors, and a greater quantity of backlight on the downstage area where you will be working as backlight. In addition, there will be similar backlight arrangements, but not as great, that will cover the pedals and the area upstage of the band for those moments when you are facing the back of the arena. In front of the stage, on a straight line bar with very minimal dimensions, is mounted a battery of high-intensity, very deep-colored lamps to light the forestage. These will be wired in 5 rich, deep colors plus white so that the follow spots can cut through with some effect. And then it just goes on with all these special effects of a sort. It's really, you know, they are special effects. It's kind of like producing a movie or producing any other big kind of production. But we get a really rare glimpse into the kind of creative decision-making that went into these productions with the kind of materials that exist in Fisher's archive papers. One last little tidbit of archival, well, I've actually got 2 more things I want to show you, and then I'll turn it over to Joanna. This is another shop memo, this one addressed to Robin Wagner, the scenic designer who basically designed and built the stage. And here we come back to the logistics of putting a tour on the road. That, you know, it's one thing to like make something look pretty. It's another thing to make something look pretty and have it be designed in a way so that you can take it on the road. And that's exactly what Fisher is trying to address to Wagner in this memo. So I'll read you the relevant pieces here. Fisher says, the drawings for the stage as presented to the shops were sufficient for theatrical purposes, but are too loose for rock and roll touring purposes. It is necessary that items meant to tour on one-nighters be extremely sophisticated in their method of assembly, weight, means of connection, and means to transport and to store. Sometimes theatrical scenic shops have a tendency to build things that might go together fast with little consideration of how they will stack in the truck, or with much consideration as to how they will stack in the truck, but not enough consideration of how much time it will take to assemble all the parts in the arena. I bring this up now because the scenic shop bids might be different when they realize the degree of sophistication required for rock and roll tours. And I think that's a really crucial point, you know, that this was sophisticated. You know, this is not just, as much as there was the desire for profit, the amount of work that went into this was not just about cash grab. This was about how do we put on the best show? And for Fisher, what that meant was precisely the need to balance the technical requirements of putting on the best show possible with the logistical requirements that allowed the production elements to go on the road. In the end, it was all about those trucks, building adjustable designs that could be efficiently broken down, stored for transport, and reassembled all over again to project something sensational. That was the lifeblood of the arena concert. So I have just one more item I want to show. This one's a little more lighthearted. Not that this has all been so serious, but still. Coming back to that giant phallus again that the Stones were using, which was also part of Fisher's design. This was a sheet of fabric swatches that were in Fisher's papers. You can see all these different fabrics that were used to construct different parts of the stage presentation. There's something for covering amp and speaker cones. There's something part of a dragon tongue that was another one of the stage props. And then on the lower left, and then blown up for detail on the right, some colored fabric that's just labeled cock. And we can assume we know what that was used for. Now, I think this is kind of awesome just to have and be able to see. But I also would end by raising this question: can we imagine P-Funk having used a similar prop, which is to say a cock of a different color, so to speak, and how that would have gone over in the sort of context of the arena concert. And I say that recognizing that P-Funk had a lot of sexual suggestiveness in their own shows, but I don't think on the scale, so to speak. And I raise this because I think this segues into what Joanna is going to talk about really importantly, that a lot of what we both try to engage with in our research is who gets represented in these spaces and who has the ability to represent themselves in particular ways. And so I'll leave off on that question and turn it over to Joanna, who will take it from here.
Thanks, Steve. I'm hoping to loop back to a lot of those points, and I, of course, love all of the archival materials that are super fun to engage with, but also literally kind of set the stage for kind of what I'm talking about, which is late 20th century, early 21st century Super Bowl shows. So I'm going to share my screen as well. Someday. All right, is that visible? Awesome, okay, yes. Great. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about kind of an overview of my project. My project is in those early stages. This is work I began quite a few years ago, but I had to put aside for other projects, and I'm coming back to it. So generally, the book historicizes and analyzes popular music's role in the NFL Super Bowl. That's generally what it does, but it has a very kind of specific historical frame. So I'm going to read to you, I didn't want to assign you, but I'll read to you a little bit of an overview of what I'm hoping that this will do. So during a 2016 preseason NFL game, television cameras closed in on the quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, Colin Kaepernick, as he took a knee during the U.S. national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, to protest the oppression of and brutality against African Americans and people of color. Kaepernick's act of resistance during a song so historically and politically meaningful fueled debates over the boundaries of structural racism and national allegiance. The ensuing fallout also served as a reminder about the evocative power of music not only to signify, but to subvert. Kaepernick's efforts to render his and other bodies of difference more visible was not the first time that music had been used to make this particular statement on an NFL field, nor was it the first time that music signifiers had been used to highlight the overtly patriotic, patriarchal, capitalist, and militarist ideologies embedded in U.S. values and its football culture. Musicians and sponsors have in fact used popular music to challenge the ideals of the game and its audiences since at least 1993, when pop's biggest celebrities were welcomed onto the Super Bowl turf and into the game's commercial breaks in an effort to attract more viewers and boost Nielsen ratings. That year, Michael Jackson's path-breaking halftime performance took strong stances on environmental policies and racism and human rights, with renditions of Heal the World, We Are the World, Jam, and Black and White. And you can see in that second picture, they rolled those big banners out onto the field to show that kind of racial unity. In the decades since, other celebrity acts have taken on increasingly divisive topics, including bigotry, marriage equality, women's rights, the Black Lives Matter movement, disability, mental health, and immigration policies. Popular music has become so essential to the Super Bowl broadcast experience in the 21st century that it has been jokingly referred to as music's biggest moment of the year. As increasingly diverse audiences tune in, especially women, Black and LGBTQIA audiences, and people of color, advertisers, corporate brands, and even the NFL League itself enjoy better bottom lines. However, decades of media coverage confirms that the relationship between American football and popular music has been uneasy, since audiences invested in the game itself and those waiting for its breaks often disagree about who belongs on the field, what values they promote, and how they perform. It comes as no surprise, then, that these debates resonate with much larger questions about inclusivity, access, and agency in the everyday lives of US residents. So my book investigates the ideological battles that have played out in the Super Bowl since the mid-1990s by historicizing how popular music has infiltrated US television's most expensive and spectacular annual sporting event, and analyzing the politics of its performances. It examines the many ways that the Super Bowl's musical acts have addressed and even fueled national debates by challenging the NFL's claim to political neutrality and the assumed values of its core audiences, since its legacy and actions have revealed its often oppressive stances towards race, gender, age, ability, national origin, and sexuality. In this book, I examine its pregame show, which has included female stars like Pink, Faith Hill, and Carrie Underwood since 2006 to appeal to the growing number of women audiences. I also look at famous national anthem performances by artists in various generations and genres. And here we have Garth Brooks. His show also had some controversy. Shea, Alicia Keys. We've got some Backstreet Boys there, and Patti LaBelle, of course. Also, there are memorable halftime shows, and here we have Bono's, this was the post 9/11 show that he did, that if you look online at the best halftime show of all time, it always lists this one, and we can talk about some of those reasons. Of course, Janet Jackson, Katy Perry, Paul McCartney, Beyoncé, and this year's Shakira and Jennifer Lopez. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not cover commercials, because obviously that's how I got into this project, is through looking at commercials. So some of these commercials that were landmark, Ray Charles's Diet Pepsi commercial actually was the same year as Michael Jackson's performance. So we had popular music framing that show. We have Cardi B there for Pepsi. We have Salt and Peppa there for Geico. Justin Timberlake there for Bye, and you can guess the song that he sang for that. And then MC Hammer for Cheetos, that was You Can't Touch This, if you missed that one from this year. So to frame, there we go. To frame the debate, it's just being slow. To frame the debates that often arise from these performances and outline what's at stake, I combine studies of music and sports, media scholarship, and intersectional cultural theory to show how the game and its musical interludes operate within what I have termed their own branded spectacles to communicate specific and often polarized values and norms. It makes sense to read the NFL and its performers as US cultural brands. The NFL's use of sponsorship and political cachet to establish itself as the premier American football league is well documented, as is the curation of performers as artist brands after MTV icons like Michael Jackson and Madonna converted their star power, not just their records, into commodity form so that everything they touched could be monetized. These artists thus modeled the now commonplace practice of wielding spectacle into specific branded and saleable identities. I therefore demonstrate that it is when the branded values of the NFL and its performers overlap during the annual telecast that their opposing ideologies can become incendiary. Put simply, the program becomes most provocative when the NFL's displays of violent masculine athleticism and nationalist values are juxtaposed on the same turf with the politics of musical performances that feature marginalized bodies who are otherwise unwelcome into the sport. I thus argue that the attention given to many of the Super Bowl's musical acts, artists who are of color, Black, women, aging, LGBTQIA, and disabled, boils down to debates about whose bodies are permitted on the field and what politics they should endorse, mirroring the very struggles that play out within American society. So as recent social movements like Black Lives Matter and Me Too have confronted sources of structural oppression in the US, my book offers further perspective on the ways that hegemonic values remain embedded in sporting cultures and the media. Music's role in making demographic markers more visible during televised sporting events has become a recurring media topic over the past few years, illuminating debates about inequalities based on race, gender, sexuality, and the like. Indeed, headlines have focused on Kaepernick's aforementioned stance against racial oppression during the national anthem, the curation of women's empowerment playlists for the US women's soccer team's World Cup game, music that mirrored their fight for equal pay, and international controversies over the homophobic language often used in Latin American soccer chants. Because American football is the most watched sport in the US and its Super Bowl championship is the most expensive and newsworthy annual event on television, this project bridges popular knowledge with critical music-focused inquiry to investigate the stakes, motives, and impacts of pop music as a political force in the broadcasts. My project thus aims to historicize how popular music has been used to subvert, resist, and reshape the game's values to encourage the kind of inclusivity and tolerance needed to embrace the Super Bowl's expanding audience. So when I came to this idea of branded spectacle, I've been following, and I'm sure you all have heard about it too, after the Black Lives Matter protests, the NFL finally gave way to meeting its players halfway, or what they consider halfway, about having Lift Every Voice and Sing precede the national anthem for a few of the preseason games. We'll see if that makes it into the Super Bowl, but what I realized is that the NFL is most interested in preserving its brand identity, and that's the thing that the literature from various sides kind of says over and over. And I think the more interesting thing is that there tends to be the thought that it's a conservative institution, but really the NFL all along has had the attitude of, we will be whatever you want us to be, right? And so it's the way that it has aligned itself historically with certain figures, people like Richard Nixon, that it has kind of formed these kind of values. Also, since Nielsen ratings really started taking off, they can look at their audience and really kind of target who is watching, and that audience has really diversified since Michael Jackson took the field that year. That was the point. So some of the ways that the overarching topics, a lot like Steve's book and some of my previous work, looks at the intersections between industries, because that's really where you find those fascinating answers, right? Questions and answers. Obviously, audiences, demographics, and expectations, and I expect Steve and I to talk more about this perhaps, or if you have questions. You know, the difference between Steve's project is people go there to see that show. And in a lot of cases, the people who witness the halftime performance live from the stadium are there to see the football game, right? And so they may or may not have the same kind of values or investment in those performances. One fun fact that I've realized by mapping all of this out, that it seems like especially those Super Bowl shows like this year's happen to fall in election years. And the biggest controversies also happen to fall in those years. So I don't think it's a coincidence that 1,300 FCC complaints that followed Shakira and J-Lo's performance happened to fall in this year. You know, and we can talk more about that. And then also the intertextuality between performances. So the idea that people are putting these well-known records, right, and well-known video spectacles onto the field. And a lot of times artists are doing what they have done in their stadium shows. And this, I think, loops back really well to Steve's work. So we don't have to talk about these things, but these are ways that I've kind of bridged Steve's work from what I've gotten to read of it and my own. And so if any of these things come to mind for you all, or you want to talk about other things, that's great. I think Steve, maybe you wanted to jump in there. Maybe.
Sorry, no, I had to unmute myself. Sure, if you're ready to start our dialogue, I'm happy to jump in, so to speak. I mean, one thing I was actually thinking about as I was listening to you talk, and you know, I started by showing the proliferation of the construction of arenas and stadiums in the 60s, 70s. But from what I know, there's another wave that happens later, like more in the 90s, 2000s. And I wonder if you've looked at that, because I think, you know, with like the Beatles at Shea, it's legendary that the sound was horrible, that Shea was not really designed to accommodate the kind of event that the Beatles were trying to put on at the time. And of course, that really gives rise to a whole other industry of sound reinforcement stuff. But by the time you get, I think, to Michael Jackson in '93, and I'm not 100% sure about this, but I think at that point, you start getting stadiums built that actually care about sound quality. And I think that probably has to be a factor in what leads to the decision to make music more a part of the production of the Super Bowl. Have you looked into that much at all? Or can you confirm that that's a trend that starts taking off around then?
Right. Yeah. I think that that's a really good point. And I also saw that Carl also put I love that. Thanks, Carl, for that comment, because that's actually where I was going to go with it. So yeah, so obviously some of the stadiums are more equipped to deal with these things. And I think we see those in those 90s shows. Even Michael Jackson's performance, if you watch it, I think it was tricky for the cameramen to know, you know, what to highlight. Sound-wise, I think it sounded pretty decent, but I think the visual was the most jarring. And it's, you know, it's in the Rose Bowl, so like that's really an open space, and you can tell, you know, the sun's beating down on everybody. And if you've ever been in that stadium, it gets really hot really quickly. And versus, you know, when they start to have them in the kind of enclosed domes, then they're able to do some things that they perhaps weren't able to do before. Of course, that messes the NFL up because they're not able to do the flyovers of the jets that they really like to do when that's the enclosed stadium. Sometimes they have the television monitors go out there. But yeah, I think sound is a huge consideration. And, you know, when they're hiring Michael Jackson, he's a veteran, right, of these kinds of tours. So I'm sure that his people played a role in kind of how it would be amplified. And there's a lot of good work talking about, you know, when the bands were doing that, the marching bands, you don't really have to worry about that, right? There's projection and numbers and brass and all of those sorts of things. But I think that the venue itself definitely makes a difference. And I think it's not just sound, but it's also the way to film it. I think, like I said, I think that those cameramen struggle in those early years of what to focus on.
Well, and that speaks to another point of difference. And we talked about this a little bit in the lead up, but, you know, the average arena or stadium show doesn't wind up being broadcast on TV.
Right.
And so there's a whole other mode in which the Super Bowl functions as an event, right? It's not only a live performance, though it is that, but it's, you know, made to also be very much for broadcast. And, you know, how does that matter from the way that you understand it as a product?
Right. So, so from what I've been reading from people inside that make the Super Bowl, or have made the Super Bowl in those early years or decades, actually. So it is all about the deadlines of everything has to be timed correctly. So they're so worried about that timing that after Garth Brooks, we can talk about that situation later, but after he almost doesn't sing, they decide to film the national anthem in advance always. That way they know the exact timing and they can make sure the person actually shows up and does their job. But they are so worried about the commercial breaks, obviously, right? And they've sold all of that time. They're worried about kind of where the audience is, you know, in terms of, so there are times where they used to do like card tricks and things with the audience, right? So they're really worried about, are they in their seats or not? There's so many factors. So the people at the top are really worried about timing. And that whole halftime show, from the second those lights go down or whatever to the end, has to be 12 minutes of getting on the field, doing the thing and getting everything off and not leaving a scratch on the field. So I think that ties back into Steve, what you were talking about is this, the kind of the actual production of it, right? The actual getting things around. And maybe you could tie that into, you know, talking about venue and setup and, you know, problems, right? Perhaps with some of the props. You said that the phallus was having a hard time, but I'm sure there's other things that went wrong as well.
Well, there are always a lot of X factors. I mean, I also just wanted to kind of pause for a moment over that issue of time that you bring up, because I think these things are so relative, right? I mean, a football game in general is pretty long. And of course, with the way you're describing it, it's long in part because you have to have all those damn commercial breaks and everything, right? But I mean, the rock concert evolved in a really complicated way in terms of duration during this same time period. You know, when the Beatles play at Shea, I think they played a set that was typically around 30, 35 minutes. And they never really evolved to the point where they were the kind of band that was playing like for an hour and a half. Like they basically retired from touring before that became more routine. But it's part of the increase of scale that happens in rock concerts and popular music concerts more generally during that time. Is it's becoming more and more geared towards having you know, one artist or a small group of artists play for longer periods. So I think that makes a particular challenge for the ones who then step into the Super Bowl, because they're used to having an hour, hour and a half or more to do their thing. And now they have to like basically condense down what they usually do on stage to like whether they do greatest hits. I mean, it'd be really interesting to have more insight into how they decide which things to present in that context. But yeah, I mean, venues are one area where there's a lot of room for snafus. I mean, as I alluded to a moment ago, I think a big part of what happens is that it's precisely the shortcomings of these venues, you know, that arenas and stadiums aren't built to house music. They're built to house other kinds of things. That gives rise to these whole sub-industries that are essential to the concert industry. I mean, sound reinforcement, lighting, these things become industries unto themselves in the 1970s in a way that they didn't have to be so much before. So like, you know, I've done writing on this one sound guy, Bill Hanley, whose career is especially well documented. There's actually a good book that just came out about him earlier this year. You know, and he started working with the Newport festivals. And at the time he did, being a sound person was like a really odd career choice for the most part. But by the late 60s, it's becoming very professionalized. And you see that just across the board. So I think there's a real important synergy between the lack of adaptability that venues had unto themselves and the things that went into making them suitable. You know, and eventually, as I was saying, the venue builders start to take that into account more. But that really doesn't happen, as far as I know, until the 90s. But there's a lot of other things that can make something go wrong. So you mentioned Garth Brooks just maybe not showing up. I mean, there are certain artists who were notorious, right? I mean, Guns N' Roses is one of those artists. But I mean, there were a lot from earlier on too. And that, I think, it often gets caricatured, that kind of thing, where it's just like bad artist behavior, which it is. But I think what it also draws attention to is that the whole arena concert industry was really kind of Frederick Taylor-esque in a way. You know, it had to work exactly according to some kind of pretty specified, predetermined plan, or it was all going to fall apart. And I think that's an area where there's a lot of parallel to what is happening with the Super Bowl production, which I think that's even more true.
Right. And that's the key, is that word production. So, you know, MTV produced Janet Jackson's show and is like blacklisted ever again from producing any of those shows, right? Now they have kind of a formulaic group, you know, they have a formula, but it took many years, you know, and as Carl pointed out, and actually this is actually a connection weirdly to Steve's. So Disney, you know, gets involved at various points. So we actually have some full Disney shows that happen as they're trying to figure out what a Super Bowl show should look like, right, post Michael Jackson. And Disney's actually the first people to come in and say in 1976 that says, hey, we kind of want to hijack your Super Bowl show so we can advertise our new ride outside called It's a Small World, right? And so that Disney actually kind of, this idea of production, right? And people from outside, again, this is that overlapping of industries, people from the outside that come in, just like you said with the Broadway people, right? That know how to do these things, that do them well and kind of make it a thing, again, in a space that's not meant for that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and in my narrative, the place where that comes up, which I find really amusing, but it's also really revealing, is ice capades type shows. You know, like those are the shows that actually know how to like build an arena so that it is a showcase. And so when they start putting on concerts more typically in arenas, they're hiring the folks from the ice capades in order to like do the rigging and get everything into place, because they're the only ones who have the expertise. It's kind of crazy.
Right, right.
Shall we open up for questions? I see there's at least a couple questions in the chat, but I guess Kim's the one who moderates, so I should let her do that.
All right, so yeah, let's start the questions. So I think it makes sense to put Eric's and Chris's questions together, since they're kind of talking to each other. Maybe Eric goes first and then Chris, and then I'll read Lucretia's question after that.
Okay.
Hey, nice presentation. Lots of things to think about for sure. I'm thinking about how Beatles, Shea Stadium, first 65, Super Bowl, first Super Bowl 66, maps exactly onto the sort of high water moment of civil rights and Black emergence in the public sphere. And if you're talking about stadiums and arenas, that's a kind of enormous public sphere. The festival becoming the arena, the Civil Rights March becoming the show. I would love for you both in your own ways to sort of think about the connections between both actual Blackness in these venues and also quote unquote Blackness, like the Led Zeppelin shirt Steve's wearing or the Stones, and the ways in which a kind of packaged Blackness might be part of the spectacles that your guys are focusing on.
Yeah, Steve, do you want to go first?
Well, I thought we were going to also hear Chris's question.
I think we should probably do it in stages, because they're both solid enough questions that you could go for a while.
Okay.
I agree.
Then I will, sure, go first. Yeah, I mean, I have a lot I could say about this. I'll try to keep it relatively concise, but couple thoughts. First of all, I talk a lot about how race is part of the arena, stadium, concert economy. The chapter that this piece comes from has a section devoted to talking about P-Funk and also Sly Stone. And Stone, I think, is an especially interesting case study, but they both are, because, you know, one of the things that comes up in writing about them is I write about them precisely because the whole notion of arena rock, and it's part of why I have trouble with that term, even though it's hard not to default into using it sometimes, is it, you know, as people like Marine Mann have been writing about and others, you know, rock automatically creates a certain frame, racially speaking. You know, Jack Hamilton talks about this as well, and I've talked about it in certain contexts. And so when Black artists move into that arena, so to speak, literally and figuratively, they do so almost as outsiders in a way that's really significant. And the arena concert economy was completely set up to favor white rock artists. So basic things like finding promoters who are willing to take on Black artists and promote them in the way that's comparable to white artists is very challenging. And Clinton writes about this in his autobiography. But Sly Stone became real kind of case in point for how there was this whole set of expectations that came to bear upon Black artists that made it really hard for them to adapt to the arena concert context. And he became sort of notorious. He was like the Axl Rose of his time, in a sense. Like, he was the one who like never showed up on time. And that became the band's narrative at a certain point. Like, if you hire Sly, you're getting something really unreliable. And so promoters who write about their own experiences, they write about Sly in these terms. And the issue I bring up is like, okay, well, that's true, but like the Stones showed up late to how many shows? Keith Richard had to be like fished out of how many gutters in order to get him up on a stage at any given time. And while that's sort of part of the Stones narrative, it's not the way that it is for Sly. So I think there's a way in which the whole narrative of the arena concert has been racialized that puts Black artists on the margins, but they were on the margins in the way that the economy of arena concerts was working as well. And that's really crucial. So, you know, I think from there, the question as to whether, and this is something I get into more when I talk about arena concerts with regard to hip hop, for instance. Should Black artists be clamoring to be part of this economy? Because on the one hand, it puts them on an equal footing with their white pop and rock star counterparts. On the other hand, it sort of forces them to engage with an industry that is marginalizing them pretty systematically. But there are, I mean, part of the reason why I write about Jay-Z, or I end the book by writing about Beyoncé, is that they very specifically made decisions that they wanted to be part of the arena concert experience. You know, Beyoncé moving into Coachella was a big statement in that regard. But even before that, she is the 6th top grossing concert artist of the 20 teens. You know, there's no other Black artist in the top 10 list of that list. So she has staged her career so that live performance matters for her in a way that's kind of unusual for Black artists, and has done so with this sense of a kind of civil rights or post-civil rights sense that this is a way in which a Black artist can claim a kind of equality. So I think that's a really crucial development to take stock of, and I'll leave it at that for now.
Right. Yeah, so when you get into the history and the politics of the NFL, right? So the NFL, you know, the whole, if you follow the Colin Kaepernick scandal, besides the highlights, when you dig into it, you know, the NFL's claim was always, we are not a political institution, which is, you know, they always claimed political neutrality. And when you look at the history of the sport itself, right? And had some really big leaps from, at first it's only for very elite Ivy League white males, right? And then there's a point where they realize they need to recruit more. So they, and sponsorship's always been a part of this. So they'd always been like trying to get people to pay their players. So then there's a point where they realize, well, we need to start recruiting other people, right? Because these leagues are starting to expand. And so you didn't necessarily have to have a degree or be at an Ivy League. And then there's a certain point in the middle of the 20th century where they start to shift to, you know, people of color. But then if you look at the kind of response that the commissioner made to his players over the summer when he agreed to let Lift Every Voice and Sing, which we can talk, that's a whole other discussion. Is that really the Black national anthem? And, you know, what does that actually do, right? He acknowledges there would be no NFL if there weren't Black players, right? So he finally kind of acknowledges the bodies on the field. And kind of one of my points that I make is that, you know, when these women or people of color get on the field, they're allowed to talk, they're allowed to make sound, right? But the players are expected to be silent, right? And really the only thing that's supposed to distinguish them are the jersey colors that they wear, right? And so like, that's all within this, like this frame of privilege and, you know, that white racial frame. So yes, all of this is really important. And to kind of, I might kind of touch on some of the other things going on there. So, you know, when we have artists like Beyoncé or there was another one in there that were not headliners. Right, yes, thank you. So Beyoncé had headlined 2 years prior with Destiny's Child. So she had been a headliner. They brought her back because she's Beyoncé and she's coming out with this new album, right? And this is this famous moment where SNL makes this great skit of like, Beyoncé didn't write this music for you. So everybody's shocked that she puts Formation on the field. And the first thing she says is, hey, ladies, right? So these women that are dressed very, they look both Black Panther-y and Michael Jackson-y, right? They have the band of bullets and the berets and everything, are talking about women's bodies and Black wealth and all of these things in a space that had just been framed as a white, you know, as a white space. We have, I if that's 2016, then that would be Faith Hill. You know, she sings the opening montage that is talking about hitting and fighting and punching and American flags and Verizon phones, right? And then the next musical number is very different. So yes, we have these kind of marginalized people of color that do end up coming in, and there sometimes are kind of, you know, in these subordinate roles. But, you know, when you look through, I have this beautiful spreadsheet of like all of these acts, and, you know, we have, it oscillates between, you know, we have Michael Jackson, and then we have a ton of country stars, then we have Disney, and then we have Diana Ross, right? And then we have this really awkward, in 1997, they do this really awkward Blues Brothers soul thing, and the only person of color they have is James Brown for like a minute, right? And so, yes, I mean, this just keeps coming up over and over about who gets to make kind of sound on the field, right? And so that's one of my points. And of course, the change had to come from it within this year. It had to come from the players themselves, but it couldn't for so long because they literally aren't allowed to make those sounds or gestures on the field, right?
Hey,
They can't celebrate anymore even, right?
just to make a quick follow-up, am I right to think that Jay-Z now has a role in producing the halftime show? So if Steve's narrative ends with Beyonce, does your narrative, in a sense, at least for today, end with Jay-Z?
Well, Jay-Z, I'm not clear that he is actually producing, but he's now the talent scout. So so here's where it gets dicey. So Shakira and J-Lo, he gets them to do it, but that is after many Black artists like Rihanna and Cardi B say, absolutely not. I stand with Kaepernick and I will not perform at this event. And so it gets dicey really quickly, right? And then, you know, they put children in cages on the field, and you wonder how that got by somebody, right? So,
Chris, did you want to still ask some variation on your question or a follow-up, or are you good?
Basically good, and I'll cede my time if others want to take it, because I feel like Joanna largely addressed my question. I could nuance it in another direction, but it's not necessary.
Okay. Okay, so I will read Lucretia's question. So she's wondering about this connection between stadium venues and fascism, if it sort of sets the stage for fascism. She's curious about corporate control, branding, and the lack of intimacy / seeing people on stage as gods rather than mere musicians.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, it was a very common critique in the 70s, like a certain kind of, it ties in. So, you know, I kind of reduced the critique of arena rock in my introduction to being about money. But there was another critique, which was it's about fascism. And so, for instance, there's this review of Kiss on tour from sometime around 76 that they're like touring in England, and the writer basically talks about how they're like, you know, the German Luftwaffe or something like that, and makes it sound like they're, you know, invading hordes who are going to bring fascism to the masses, because after all, they have those weird S's in their name, so they must be Nazis. Leave alone that they're actually Jews, but whatever. And so I do think that that specter has surrounded some variations of the arena and stadium concert phenomenon. You know, and I think the critique in that regard owes a lot to, whether it's intended to or not, owes a lot to the whole Frankfurt School, Adorno and Horkheimer version of popular culture critique. And I remain sort of skeptical of that as such. But I do think it's really important to consider, and this is a question I treat throughout my book in different ways, like, what is a crowd drawn to when they attend these events? And what makes a crowd of a very particular sort when they are attending a musical performance? And, you know, there's a lot of critical thinking about crowds, some of which is very, I mean, well before Adorno and Horkheimer, there was a lot of very anxiety-laden commentary from certain kinds of European intellectuals about the meaning of the crowd and about the crowd as a source of social and political disorder. And I'm alert to that, but I also find it really compelling to think about crowds having other kinds of significance. And of course, in the discourse around, say, Woodstock and music festivals, we tend to see crowds as more liberatory, and yet somehow we see them as less liberatory when they're in the context of a stadium. And I think that's a dichotomy that we might question. There are some reasons why it's also a distinction to make, not necessarily in terms of fascism, but in terms of the very different nature of those kinds of events and how they put people in the immediate touch with each other, so to speak. You know, I do think it matters that the arena and stadium concert crowd, as I kind of alluded to before, is a reproducible crowd, right? You try to generate a version of it night after night after night. And yet, for the members of the audience, each event is sort of unique, or at least, you know, it's idealized as such. So I think that, and I think that in terms of the kind of stagecraft that I was talking about, that someone like Jules Fisher is behind, that stagecraft produces spectacle, but I think a big part of that spectacle is precisely to make the audience feel like somehow they are closer to the star. You know, so there's this, I think, really complex mechanism that happens with arena and stadium concerts between proximity and intimacy between performer and audience, and then distance and spectacle. And I think both of those things are happening. And to some extent, they're happening like materially, but it's also very much ideological. It's part of what the arena concert produces, is that sense of ideological proximity that just being in the same space as the star can be satisfying. And I mean, I will say, like, as somebody who grew up going to these kinds of shows myself, I felt that completely, even when I was sitting in the nosebleed seats. So I think it's part of the fantasy apparatus of rock, and I don't think it's just false consciousness, but it's also certainly to be, you know, queried and critiqued.
Okay. So Brian, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hello. My question specifically for Joanna. I'm really interested in this 1993 Super Bowl event, and we just did this in my doctoral seminar talking about We Shall Be Free and like country protest. And you've highlighted a lot about how the sort of Michael Jackson protest elements, but it's this crazy event where both there's the Garth Brooks country protest and there's the Michael Jackson pop protest. And I was wondering if you could speak to that moment, and especially like who gets to be seen, whose protest counts, who's represented in those spaces, and specifically reception. Like, I actually don't know if they were received differently, like if people gave Garth Brooks a pass and didn't give Michael Jackson a pass. So anything you have to say about that would be great. Thank you.
Sure. So, you know, it's a weird, tricky phenomenon. So basically Garth Brooks gets mad. Garth Brooks was promised that his new video about Rodney, well, you know, that addressed the Rodney King video would be broadcast before the national anthem performance, and they kind of messed up and didn't do it. And so basically, you know, there's this whole comical thing where like he's like putting on his Super Bowl outfit and then taking it off, and then like putting it on and taking it off, right? And the people are getting really mad. So what happens is, because it's a timing thing, they're freaking out and they're like, we don't know how we can push the start of the game 3 minutes. Like, this is going to be a problem. So they eventually, like, he's literally getting in his limo and they walkie-talkie him and they're like, it's on, like, put your costume back on, we're going to show it, right? So they do end up showing it, but they show it before the national anthem. And to be honest, the audience isn't that big at that point, if that makes sense. Like, so they had already publicized both Ray Charles's commercials and Michael Jackson's performance to death, right? So I think people were tuning in, like that was the point. But I'd have to actually look at if they did the separate ratings, but I don't think people noticed at that moment, because they basically stuck it in really quickly and then cut to the national anthem and then cut to the game, you know, so they cut a lot of stuff together very quickly. Whereas, of course, Michael Jackson just had more time. And he was, you know, unfortunately, I guess for Garth Brooks, is the bigger star. So that's the person that people are paying attention to. but both of them, I think it's also something to remember about the way the Super Bowl works is you don't get paid for that. You're paid in publicity, and so both of them encouraged the NFL, and their Frito-Lay is the sponsor. They both encourage them to donate to specific kinds of their charities, right? Their groups that for a lot of Michael Jackson's were about like kids like reading, inner city poverty, things like that. So I think that had maybe Brian, like we could speculate, right, had people paid attention to both, is there a certain validity more right in Michael Jackson's perhaps, or perceived that way, than Garth Brooks? I think it's tricky, because I think Brooks's audience would pay attention to him, right? Whereas Michael Jackson's audience would pay attention. I don't know. What sorts of things did your students come up with?
Well, in general, they just were confused by the idea of a country protest song, because they're a conception of what they think of as country, because they're not country fans, right?
Right.
And so it was a striking moment, just genre-wise, in terms of race. But thank you, that was great. Thanks.
Okay, Carl, you have a question. Do you want to unmute?
Sure. Yeah, so Steve, I was really struck. This is mostly for Steve, but Joanna, you might have stuff to say in relation to this too. I don't know. Thinking about the creation of the form as a like technological and physical feat, and your mention of Altamont brought me around to thinking about how we still discuss safety in terms of nightclubs, and especially like more sort of gray market venues. But it's been with one or two rare exceptions I could think of, safety at stadium shows doesn't feel like something we talk about much anymore. And obviously you mentioned Altamont, there's obviously Cincinnati and the Who. Those are the couple of like flashpoints that I know of, but I wonder if there's a whole evolution of how the form regularized around both like stage safety and crowd control, and just whether there's anecdotal or particular industry milestones in that.
Yeah, it's not something that's easy to track. I can say that, first of all. I think you're right that this is less stadium, more arena, but the other moment that I think is really crucial to that narrative is the hip hop moment, right? Like when Run DMC is touring, the whole narrative of their tours for the first few years they were on the road was all about unrest at their concerts, and safety became like the only story people were telling on some level about hip hop as a live phenomenon when it started moving into larger venues. I mean, to some degree even before that, but especially at that point. So, Fresh Fest in '84 does not have that much chaos attached to it at all. It's kind of striking that that's not part of the narrative. That really kind of rises in '85, '86. There's a Christmas show, hip hop show at Madison Square Garden with Curtis Blow and various folks. And there was some reported violence at that show, and that became a big blow up thing. And then it's really Run DMC's '86 tour, which had several incidents, the most well publicized of which happened at the Long Beach Arena. And it was, supposedly a bunch of gang members showed up at the concert and started threatening people and actually beating people up and waving guns at each other. And it made national news. Run DMC never even performed that night. And they didn't cancel the rest of their tour, but it definitely got thrown up in the air. And it, by the late 80s, early 90s, you've got The Source basically bemoaning that like there are no hip hop concerts anymore because they've basically been hounded out of existence by the real issue. So this isn't less about technology. It was about insurance. In order to put on a big show, you got to get insured. And insurers were charging hip hop acts much higher premiums than any other acts that were touring. And so it became much harder to produce hip hop shows on a large scale. So there was already a sort of barrier against African-American artists in that economy. And then that just raised the barrier that much higher. But what you certainly do see is, some work happens after the Cincinnati event for sure. Although the guy who promoted that event, Larry Magid, was kind of unapologetic in a weird way. He never really fully owned that it was a badly designed event, and never really like accepted that the sort of festival seating arrangement was like a bad idea for everybody. But be that as it may, I think there were a lot more controls put in place after that moment. But then when hip hop comes up, there is a whole other wave of fear, and then there's more control. So what you start seeing in the 80s is a lot more talk of like the kinds of security things that we now associate with going into a show, but that at that time were mostly associated with airports. And people are writing about this as though it's a very new thing, that you would go to a concert venue and have to pass through a metal detector, for instance. So I think the 80s was a real turning point for taking this concern about safety and institutionalizing it. And I think at that point, what you see is that this stuff happens sort of on the ground level, and then it becomes institutionalized and it becomes professionalized. And so I think, you look at photos of security guys from the 70s and they all look like they're basically bar bouncer type dudes. But later on you see them and they look like what I think we now associate, which some of them still look like big bar bouncer dudes, but they're wearing outfits and uniforms, and there's a whole other apparatus to sort of identify that they are a presence. And I think that really takes off from the 80s forward. So yeah, at that point, it's not like there aren't still incidents, but they don't get anywhere near the sort of press coverage. And I think large scale events, there's so much at stake that for the most part, the promoters really do what they can to try to ensure safety. And if they don't, they tend to go out of business. I think at the club level, it's easier to cut corners. And so that's why we hear more about those kinds of events. So does that answer your question? Great.
Sure, yeah.
Emily has a question. Emily, do you want to unmute?
Sure. Hi. Hi, both. I just wonder how you might be thinking about borders and border crossings in your kind of respective projects. Steve, I was thinking about giant trucks crossing or not crossing physical land borders that the US shares with other places. And Joanna, I was thinking about the Super Bowl and broadcasting in the context of US cultural imperialism. So I'm not sure if that's something you might want to comment on. I'd be curious.
Joanna, do you want to take that one first?
Sure. Thank you, Emily. That's a great question. So yes, there's a lot of borders, right, and non-borders. So the Super Bowl is broadcast worldwide, right, which is something that kind of people forget. So definitely it has influence right around the world. And I think that another thing I've been trying to map out, and it's not a one-to-one kind of ratio, but I've been trying to figure out, when certain shows are in certain places, what kinds of music are played there. Sometimes yes, and like, southern states, maybe red states, you hear more country music, and sometimes in more northern states, like definitely like near Detroit, you get Diana Ross, right? Things like that. So, there's those kind of boundaries, but there's a lot of, I think, ideological boundaries, like you said, that are often crossed in various ways. And, when I think about this year's show, which I personally have watched a lot of shows in a row, and I felt like in terms of cohesion, this year's show was probably the most cohesive I've seen, because they kept the focus on the two stars, and they did bring in a few other people, but it was really about them. But they did this really kind of diasporic tour of all of the ways that their cultures outside of the US, right? Shakira's multiple ethnic backgrounds, and also Jennifer Lopez's, and even her time in the Bronx, how they bring that all on the stage. And I think that's another thing that really infuriates audiences, because they bring not only the sounds but the sights of these cultural signifiers, right? And so they're calling to Miami, but they're showing how diverse Miami is, right, by bringing it to the stage. And again, this kind of goes back to the idea of immigration and the children in the cages. And I think this year's show really highlighted kind of the fluidity of those borders.
Yeah, so borders, obviously, you can go in a lot of directions with that. And so I want to think about the global part of that, because I precisely don't really write about it that much in my book. It's very much a US-centric project, which I did in part because to make it otherwise, I mean, as it is, the book is projected to be 672 pages, so I didn't want it to be 1,000. But that's also not the whole extent of the explanation by any means. And so a couple thoughts. I mean, I think concert touring matters in part precisely because of the way it involves a kind of mobility. And I think that mobility means crossing borders, whether they're internal, national borders, or between states and states, or between countries. You know, one of my very early chapters is about the Fisk Jubilee Singers, you know, the really significant group of African-American singers from the 1870s. And it was really crucial for them to be able to tour, right? Just to tour at all was part of what made them such an iconic presence in the post-Civil War Reconstruction era environment of the US at that time. And the fact that they also toured overseas really mattered as well, right? Because it showed that African-American artists had the capacity to travel and had the capacity to make an impression on European elites, which of course, certain Americans find that to be a very impressive thing to be able to do. But on a different scale, what I would want to reference, and I think this really matters, and I don't get into it in as much detail in my own project as I might have, but the real growth of the concert industry in the last couple decades has very much been about globalization. And that has a lot, it has a lot to do with artists who are touring, not just domestically, but internationally. But it also has to do with the industry itself and how it has become increasingly global in the way that it works. So to give an example, like one of the main music industry moguls, or live music industry moguls specifically, of the last couple of decades is Michael Cole, who is a Toronto-based live music promoter who got his real like boost in his career working with the Rolling Stones. And he was their promoter when they would come to Toronto. But then he worked a deal with them where he made it very profitable for them to use him as their promoter more broadly. And so he took on, I think it was the Steel Wheels tour that he promoted, and it was the first tour that he took on as their primary promoter. And from that, he leveraged himself into being one of the most important power brokers in the whole industry. And then he became the president of Live Nation. And Live Nation is called a nation, but it's a completely global enterprise. And it's the wheels that set live music in motion as a global enterprise largely run through Canada. And there are a number of other Canadian promoters who also have played a really significant role. And I think maybe because they were so much concerned with bringing artists from outside so much of the time for their biggest events, they already had an eye on the global market in a way that some American promoters did not have. So they had a vision that lent itself to the kind of even greater economy of scale that grew in the Live Nation era relative to what had existed in the 70s, which is a whole other order. So that's one way in which I think the borders really matter to the live music realm. And I could say more about that, but I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks for the question, Emily.
Okay, so thank you. So we'll wrap up now, but I just wanted to say thank you to Joanna and Steve. That was fantastic. Please be sure to join us next week when Larissa Mann will be here talking about her book in progress with UNC Press, Rude Citizenship, Jamaican Popular Music, Copyright, and Colonial Power.